studied verse 7 last week. 7 to 9, the so-called Laodicean or Laodicean War. This is the beginning in verse 7. Ptolemy the second is dead. His son Ptolemy the third has come to the throne. He rushes into Syria, remember, to at least make a valid attempt to save his sister, Berenice, from the murderous plans of Laodice. He's unsuccessful in saving her. It's too late. She's already dead, but he has revenge in putting Laodice to death, hence the name of the war, the Laodicean or Laodicean War. And then he simply overruns the entire Seleucid Empire. This is what verse 6 is dealing with, or verse 7 rather is dealing with, which is something we've already looked at. We're just reviewing a little bit. He captures, first of all, Seleucia, which you should already be a little familiar with from Book of Acts studies. He captures Seleucia, which is the seaport to the Seleucid Empire and the Seleucid capital, Antioch. And not only does he capture Seleucia, the seaport, but he captures Antioch as well. Now, why isn't he able to capture the king, Seleucus II? Well, Seleucus II has retreated into the Taurus Mountains of Asia Minor, and there he stays for a while until Ptolemy III has gone. I did bring a map to show you some of what I'm talking about, to show you how broad the extent of the overrun of the Seleucid Empire was. We don't have everything on here. I don't have the Mesopotamian region, but we're also familiar with the Mesopotamian region. I don't think it'll matter one way or the other whether we've got that or not. Now what you have on there, it's rather small. That's plenty big enough to be able to see. We're going to be over at the far right hand side, but you can see what I'm talking about. Alexandria is somewhere over at this area. Just keep in mind it's got to be somewhere west of the mouth of the Nile River. So here is the Ptolemaic Empire. Ptolemy III, not by sea but by land, so he goes right through Israel. Remember, Israel is centered right in between these two opposing empires. That's why we have all of our problems. Or that's why it's being dealt with, because Israel is going to have her problems with them later on. Here's the Seleucid Empire. It controlled all of Mesopotamia over to the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley and a large section of Asia Minor. Here's, you can't probably read it anywhere, but you can see where I'm pointing. Seleucia, right here is the seaport, and here's the capital, Antioch. So he comes up, captures Seleucia, captures Antioch, goes all the way over to Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, and subdues everything there. As a matter of fact, Justin tells us that if he would not have been called home, Ptolemy III, to put down some internal strife back in Egypt, he probably would have completely annihilated the Seleucid Empire so that Daniel 11 could never be fulfilled, because there would be no king of the north after that. So that's the only thing that was all in the providence of God that got him back home in time to keep him from wiping the Seleucid Empire off of the map. Seleucus II flees up to the Taurus Mountains, Taurus, which run in this direction, southern what is today Turkey, that runs along the same line as the Mediterranean Sea. The famous Cilician Gates, there's only one way you can get over these mountains. These mountains are beautiful, and the Cilician Gates, I think there's a highway through there now. There used to be nothing but a river, but Alexander, anyone who's going from anywhere up here over to here, you're not going to go this way. It's a long way. There's no population up there. Population's always been centered down in this direction. You'll come this way, and you'll come to these, 10,000 foot high mountains, and this 10,000 foot high mountain range. There's no way over except if you're going to climb over it. But there are the Cilician Gates that are somewhere a little bit north of Tarsus, which is Paul's hometown, somewhere in this direction, this area. The mountains run this way, and the gate cuts through. In other words, it's a narrow gorge or valley, very, very narrow, that splits this mountain range not in half, more to the eastern end, but goes through it, dissects it, so people can pass through. But as I was saying, Alexander the Great, whenever he marched against Darius, and whenever Darius first came to fight at the Battle of Granicus, they all had to do their passing through here. Whenever Paul is going from Antioch, Jerusalem, then to Antioch, and then to minister in this area, he passes along the exact same footsteps as Alexander the Great. There was nothing but a river that flowed through there, and you had to walk on one shore or the other. So all of these great leaders and the early great Christian missionaries had to go through there. So they all touched one another. The ones that came after the ones that came before and had to walk in the same area. Only reason I'm mentioning that is because somewhere probably he went through, Seleucus II went through the Cilician gates and hid out somewhere in the mountains, and that's the only thing that kept him alive, and that's the only thing that kept the Seleucid Empire from falling completely apart. Assuming for the moment that Ptolemy III was not called back to Egypt because of internal strife, then there's not a lot more he could have done than what he did. He overran the whole empire. He took all the possessions, all the major cities. He took the capital. And we're going to get into the details of this. This is what verse 8 will be about in Daniel 11, the details of the Laodicean or Laodicean War. He goes all the way over to Tigris, Euphrates River Valley. So he subdues the whole area. But the one thing is he never got to the king, Seleucus II, because he's hiding out in the Taurus Mountains. So I'm saying that if he would not have been called back home, there's nothing else he could have done except try to find the king and make sure he ends up dead, because as soon as Ptolemy leaves, then Seleucus is going to come back and try to establish some empire. We don't have to worry about that happening, of course, because Ptolemy III was called back home because of internal strife. Seleucus II came back, and we're going to see some of these verses as we study tonight, that he did establish the empire again. Now, Josephus does make reference to this Laodicean War. If you want to take note of his book Against Apion, Book 2, Chapter 5. I think I'll read just a small section of this paragraph, maybe just a few lines here, but it explains and details a little of what's going on in Daniel 11, 7 and 8. Now this Apion was unacquainted with almost all of the kings of those Macedonians, whom he pretends to have been, I guess I need to get a little further. His progenitors, who were yet very well affected towards us, for the third of those Ptolemies, who was called Ergetes, remember he's the third, when he had gotten possession of all Syria by force, of all Syria, which is simply saying what I've said before, that he overran the empire. And this is an interesting statement by Josephus that's not backed up anywhere else, but it's not contradicted. But that really doesn't prove anything one way or the other. When he did this, overran all Syria by force, he did not offer his thank offerings to the Egyptian gods for his victory, but he came to Jerusalem, and according to our own laws offered many sacrifices to God, and dedicated to him such gifts as were suitable to such a victory. That's one of those many things as Christians would like to believe, or as Jews you'd like to believe, but just because you'd like to believe it doesn't mean it has any historicity to it at all. So I think we need to pick up then with the 8th verse. Verse 7, you should have now a reading as follows: "But a branch of her roots shall stand up in his estate." Remember, we only have one partitive here as the preposition from or out of, and yet King James gives us two. In other words, it would divide this one theme of a branch of her roots up into three distinct areas, and I guess have reference to three people if you leave it the way King James does. For instance, what I mean by that is this: but out of a branch, something's going to come out of the branch. So there's number one. What's it going to come out of? The branch. Number two, someone is talking about people here. Out of the branch is number one. The branch is number two. Of her roots is number three. So you've got the roots of Berenice, then she has a branch, or the roots rather have a branch, then out of the branch comes this one, the topic of the following verses then, which of course doesn't make any sense at all. We've already discussed how this is a genealogical reference here, a branch of her roots. Her roots were her parents, and a branch of her parents was her brother. And did anything come out of her brother? You see, but out of a branch? In other words, that would read, but out of her brother? Well, no, nothing came out of her brother. We're talking about her brother. That's the one we're talking about, Ptolemy III. So you strike out the phrase out of, and the added in word one. But a branch of her roots shall stand up in his estate. This is in the year 245 BC. And references to her brother Ptolemy III. Who shall come, and the implication of this word with, as we saw in Isaiah's prophecy, is against. Who shall come against an army? That is the army of the north, of the king of the north. And shall enter into the fortress, collective term. It's singular, but it has a plurality of reference. We just saw two places, Seleucia and Antioch, that he overran. Well, which would be the fortress? Well, I think it's probably too refined of an argument to pick one over the other. Because Seleucia has some good points because it's the seaport. Antioch has better points, it's the capital. Fortress is probably a collective term that refers not only to Antioch, not only to Seleucia, not only to both of those, but all of the empire of the king of the north. Of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. Now we haven't gotten into, we'll start getting into verse 8 tonight, but we already know, you see, who the victor of the war is. He shall deal against them, Ptolemy III, and he shall prevail. So we know who the winner is going to be, Ptolemy III, and not Seleucus II. Okay, let's start with new material then in verse 8. And he, that is the king of the south, shall also carry captives into Egypt, their gods, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold. And he shall continue more years than the king of the north. And so the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land. Now there's much ambiguity here, particularly in verse 9, the whole verse as a matter of fact, in the definition of the subject and the object, and I would say in the end of verse 8 as well. So we'll start with the easy material, and we'll do the first 2/3 of verse 8, beginning with the two words and shall, and ending with the word gold. The first 2/3 of verse 8. And shall also carry captives into Egypt their gods, with their princes, with their precious vessels of silver and of gold. Now this is the first time that Egypt is mentioned by name as the kingdom of the south. And it's the only time that it's mentioned by name as the kingdom of the south until we get to the section verses 36 through 45. Where it will appear a few more times, I think maybe a couple of times, if that many, which is beyond the first 35 verses and the Ptolemaic Seleucid War. So in other words, that doesn't really count with our tallying up or enumeration of times that Egypt is found. We've already looked at some of this before in determining way back to the very beginning the kingdom of the north, the kingdom of the south. Well, south and north of what? Who would that be? And when you know some of the history that this does fit into some historical battles and historical periods of time, then you can determine it's north and south of Israel. You can guess that anyway. Well, north and south, it wouldn't be north and south of Miami. It's got to have something to do with biblical places in biblical times. So Israel, Palestine would be a good guess. But you really don't need to guess because of this one verse. Because of this one verse, verse 8. He shall carry captives back into his kingdom, the king of the south. Well, if he's the king of the south and he's going to carry captives back into his kingdom, and his kingdom is given by name here as Egypt, then it's very easy to make certain that it's Egypt as you compare the rest of the details of the verses from 2 through 35, as well as determine, well, who would the king of the north be? Because you can tell right away what the measurement of all of this is, Palestine. South of Palestine would be Egypt, north would be Syria. So here's the first and the only time that Egypt is mentioned by name. Although the Septuagint has Egypt by name mentioned in several places, such as in verse 5, 6, 9, 11, 14, 15, and 29. For some reason, we don't just have the Negev or the Ha-Negev, but we have a direct reference to a country by name in the LXX, and that's Egypt. So Ptolemy, we see from verse 7, is successful in his invasion of Syria. And what does his success obtain for him? Well, 4 things are mentioned here in this part of the verse that we're studying. 4 things are mentioned: gods, princes, precious silver vessels, precious golden vessels. 4 things are mentioned. Now, as you're writing those down or observing in your Bible those 4 things, one of them kind of stands out as a little bit strange. It's like a multiple choice question when you have to select the one unassociated word or item or phrase. Gods, we know that you can't take, gods and visible gods, but, pictures and images and statues of gods, you can certainly take that. Precious vessels of silver, precious vessels of gold. And the 4th one, to me anyway, and hopefully it does to you, is the one that stands out. That just stands out. If you wanted to pick one out of the 4 in a multiple choice question, which one is unassociated? Gods, I can see how that could go with precious vessels of silver, because maybe the vessels of silver are in themselves some form of representation of God. Or perhaps they have something to do with the service of that idol that's mentioned as a god here in the beginning of the verse. But princes, and right in the middle, princes between gods, precious vessels of silver, precious vessels of gold. Well, let's look into the Hebrew of this. Daniel chapter 11, verse 8, 1, 2, 3. The 4th word over is the word we're concerned about. The 4th word over is the word we're concerned about. And it comes from the root nasach, N-A-S-A-C-H. Nasach, long A, short A. A samich and not a sin. A final cough. A verb which means to pour out or to cast. A verb which means to pour out or to cast is the root meaning of this verb nasach. The word you have in your text, as you can see, is nesehem. Now, a derivative of this basic root, nasach, is the word nesech, N-E-S-E, long E, short E, C-H, final cough, nesech, which means a drink offering or a molten image. Now go back to our root here, nasach. 2 meanings. One, to pour out. Another, to cast. And look at the 2 meanings of nesech, a drink offering, or a molten image. Well, you would pour out a drink offering, and you would cast a molten image. Not cast in the sense of throw, but, form. Form this image in, some mold. Another derivative, which is really what our longer word comes from, is the word nasich, N-A-S-I-C-H, nasich, which can mean a drink offering, as nesech does on occasion. One reference to this, there are many references to this translation, is Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 38. Deuteronomy 32 and verse 38. Which did eat the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their drink offerings, or nasich, their drink offerings. Deuteronomy 32:38. Let them rise up and help you and be your protection. However, it also can be and is on one occasion translated prince. Prince. And this brings us back to our subject there in Daniel 11. And that reference is Ezekiel chapter 32 and verse 30. And this may even have been the basis in the minds of the King James translators for the translation as princes in Daniel 11 and verse 8. But we'll take a look at this anyway. Ezekiel 32:30. The very beginning of the verse, there be the princes. Ezekiel 32 is a very vivid description of Sheol and who has been cast there and who's lower than whom. So he's just enumerating various princes, kings, leaders of these pagan nations which have gone against Judah and Jerusalem. There be the princes of the north, all of them, and all the Zidonians which are gone down with the slain, and so forth. There it's this same word, nasik, which is a derivative of nasach, and really the basis for our word nesehehim, which is what we find in Daniel 11 and verse 8. Going back to Daniel 11, what in the world would it mean here? Well, taken into consideration, along with both the meanings of these various words as well as derivatives, and in addition to that, the context in which it's found with God's precious vessels of silver, precious vessels of gold. Here in Daniel 11:8, it only seems obvious that if you've got the choice between a prince or a molten image, since really the basic root meaning can have to do with pouring out a drink offering or casting in a form or to mold some god, in a die, cast it in a die to form that, I think it's obvious that in no way does the angel or Daniel have reference to princes, but rather to molten images. So you'll have to change princes to molten images. He's not talking about people here, but he's talking about another variety of these gods. Gods as statues, gods as molten images, gods as rocks or stones or stumps or trees, whatever type would be included there under the first term God, would probably not be included here under the second term as molten image. Molten images. Precious vessels of silver and of gold would probably be what I've intimated before. Remember, whenever Nebuchadnezzar sacked Jerusalem and the temple, he couldn't take any gods because the only god they served was an invisible God. But he did take the vessels that were used in religious services. He took the various vessels of silver and gold and other precious metals that were used in the temple service. So probably this is what he has reference to here in taking the precious vessels of silver and of gold. So we know we're talking about polytheistic pagan nations here, although I doubt I had to tell you that for you to know that. The only true nation that worships God's Israel, and she hasn't generally done a very good job of that. So here's a little history of what's going on according to Jerome. Jerome tells us that 40,000 talents of silver. We don't have references to all of these four categories, but to a few. 40,000 talents of silver were taken by Ptolemy III, whenever he goes back into Egypt. And 2,500 religious images. Not necessarily every one representing an individual god, but they're bound to have more than one god that they're serving. We know from other studies that they do. So he takes back at least this much. We know more because this doesn't give us the goal, or it doesn't tell us when you're talking about religious images, are we talking about the gods here mentioned in Daniel 11 in verse 8, or are we talking about molten images, or are we talking about a combination? We're not trying to be overly technical, but somehow there's a distinction, or the two words would not be given. Something else that's very interesting that he takes back to Egypt were all the Egyptian religious icons. Now, how in the world had these gotten in Syria into Antioch? As a matter of fact, this is why they gave him this fancy name, Euergetes. It means benefactor. Whenever he comes back, all the people are praising him. Why? Well, as someone has mentioned, Cambyses. Remember in our studies earlier, about 300 years earlier, whenever he went down to Egypt, just ransacked the place and had taken all of these Egyptian molten images, gods, precious vessels of silver and of gold, took these to Persia. But who's in control, as we've already intimated in earlier studies before this, and as well as earlier tonight, as a matter of fact, of Mesopotamian region? Well, the Seleucid Empire. So whatever treasures, in other words, were in Babylon or ancient ruins of Nineveh or anything, especially your various Persian capitals like Susa or Persepolis or Ecbatana, then these would be taken to the new capital of the empire that controlled that part of the world. That's the Seleucid Empire, and that would be in Antioch. So the Egyptians are very grateful whenever he gets back home. He not only brings with him all of these new vessels of silver and gold that he's taken from the Seleucid Empire, but he brings back all of the very, very important and no doubt very, very ancient. They've been in Persia now for over 300 years. Very ancient Egyptian religious icons that have been captured by Cambyses. So you say, well, what's the big deal about all this? Why take up, the first 2/3 of this 8th verse just detailing the fact that he took back religious icons? We don't have any mention, since we strike out the word princes here, we don't have any mention of them capturing, human captives to take back as slave labor. You don't even have a reference here to casualties that were suffered by the Seleucids at the hands of the Egyptians, or really the Macedonians, the Ptolemies. You don't have any reference to human casualties or to human captives that are taken. The only reference that we have here is to religious icons. Well, the best solution to that problem is the following answer. Probably that's the only thing dealt with, because only in this way, that is, only in taking all of the religious icons of a nation in the thought patterns of the people of that day, could you really completely and totally conquer the country that's described. And we're going to look at some references to this. We even have mentioned one before that has to do with Israel and Judah and Jerusalem as well. In other words, it was one of the greatest horrors of warfare, not to lose 100,000 men, but to lose your gods that govern your country and bless you with sunshine and bless you with rain and bless your crops and bless you with productivity. That's one of the greatest horrors of the ancient wars, is for a person to have their gods, or a country or a city to have their gods captured and taken by their enemies. Remember the story way back in Genesis chapter 31, whenever Rebekah now is, Genesis chapter 31 and verse 30. Whenever Laban has his relatives fleeing, and Rachel takes these images, as we see back in verse 19. Rachel takes the images with her. And really that's the reason that Laban is so upset with Jacob and Rachel and Leah and the rest of their band, is because he's been totally subdued, not just in the fact that he's lost some daughters and lost some grandchildren and lost some sheep and lost some cattle, but verse 30, and now, though thou wouldest needs be gone, because thou sore longest after thy father's house. He's saying it's all right, it's understandable that it's time for you to go and that you want to go. Yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods? That represented to him total subjection and total humiliation in the eyes of everyone that he knew. Laban, where are your gods? They're stolen. You mean you're a godless man? That's what he would be. A godless man. A man who has no hope. 1 Samuel chapter 5. An interesting story of one of the gods of the Philistines. 1 Samuel chapter 5. Remember this old Dagon here that falls down and finally has his hands cut off. He ends up nothing but a stump, and the Philistines then have a lot of trouble with something that they have in their possession, because it's just wrecking Dagon, and it's bringing some type of curse and physical plague upon them. But what has caused all of this? What's Israel upset about? Well, we could say, quote unquote, that Israel's God had been captured at this time. Chapter 5, verse 1, the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer unto Ashdod. You say, I thought you said earlier that Israel didn't have gods in physical form. Well, she didn't according to God's laws. The God that didn't have a physical form set those laws down. But Israel, whenever she got into trouble with the Philistines, what did she say back in chapter 4? Bring the ark out. If you'll bring the ark and put it right in the middle of the battle, then God is here. Because they equated not God as being the God of the universe, but He lives inside that box over there. And if we can bring our God here, then the victory is ours. What happens? The first thing those Philistines go after is, let's capture their gods. When we capture their gods, they're done in. And what do? They capture the Ark of the Covenant. Now, as far as Israel is concerned, she's defeated. But of course, that's the first pagan god, or god, not a pagan god, but the first time the pagans captured someone else's god and the god ever fought back. I mean, whenever Ptolemy takes these images down into Egypt, they don't fight back to get back home. But here you've got a box, the Ark of the Covenant. Oh, it's beautiful. And God, well, if He's literally in that, He's literally outside of that too, because He's everywhere. So that way you can't bind me one way or the other if some statement that I make. I think I'm giving you all of them, just a few. But you'll know what these references mean then when you come across them later. It was something significant as far as the people who were involved were concerned whenever they had their gods taken. Hosea 10:5, the inhabitants of Samaria shall fear because of the calves of Bethaven. Remember, the nation of Israel started worshiping calves after the division of the kingdom after Solomon's death. For the people therefore shall mourn over it, and the priests thereof that rejoiced on it for the glory thereof, because it is departed from it. Talking about the capture of the calves of the northern kingdom of Israel. Whenever they're captured, then the people are subjected then to their enemies, and they have great cause and reason to be grieving. Jeremiah chapter 48 and verse 7. Cause because that's all they know. They've fallen away from true religion. Jeremiah 48:7. For because thou hast trusted in thy works and in thy treasures, thou also shall be taken. And Chemosh shall go forth into captivity with his priests and his princes together. Well, you see, there weren't really gods like Dagon or Chemosh or Molech. These were images that represented demons in the minds of people. Chapter 49 and verse 3. Jeremiah chapter 49 and verse 3. Howl, O Heshbon, for I have spoiled. Cry, ye daughters of Rabbah. Gird you with sackcloth, lament, run to and fro in the hedges, for their king shall go into captivity. Well, probably Malcolm, their god, shall go into captivity. Another reference to an image here, and his priest and his princes together. And then in Isaiah 46, I think we've used this before, but Isaiah chapter 46, verses 1 and 2. What's he talking about here? We've discussed this before in the Apocrypha, but now you'll see a little more. Isaiah 46, verses 1 and 2. Bel boweth down, Nebo stoopeth. Their idols were upon the beasts and upon the cattle. And he's talking about captivity of Babylon here. What's the first thing that he mentions? The chapter opens up with this. The fact that they're going to be totally subjected in that their idols are taken captive. Bel boweth down. These were idols that represented several gods among the Babylonians. Nebo stoopeth. Their idols were upon the beasts and upon the cattle. What does he mean there? Well, they fill their packs up on the back of their camels and donkeys and cattle and oxen and so forth with these images, with these gods. Your carriages were heavy loaden. They were a burden to the weary beasts. They were so full of silver and gold that represented the idols of the Babylonians. They stooped, they bow down together. They could not deliver the burden, but themselves are gone into captivity. This is why no reference is made to anything besides religious icons in Daniel 11 and verse 8. You don't have to tell us about any captives. That's not to say they did not take captives back. That's not to say there were no casualties. Obviously there were in the battle. But it is to say this is the best way to describe exactly what's going on. We're talking about total subjection. And then over in the last chapter of 2 Chronicles, the fall of Jerusalem and the fall of the temple, what do the Babylonians take? They make sure they empty the temple of all of the vessels. They go right down to spoons and bowls and plates and everything. Why? I doubt that Babylon had any need of any more silver or gold. She had enough from other peoples whom she had conquered, and she had enough of her own to begin with. But you don't hardly want to go back home just victorious in a battle if you don't have the gods of that nation to take along with you. So in essence, this is what the angel and therefore the prophet Daniel is describing for us, the details of this war in the first 2/3 of verse 8. He shall also carry captive into Egypt their gods, their molten images, their precious vessels of silver, and their precious vessels of gold. Okay, let's come to the second part of the verse that we'll study. And he shall continue more years than the king of the north. He shall continue more years than the king of the north. Well, there are about 3 guesses of what this phrase really means. It appears to be rather self-explanatory on the surface, but in fact it's not. He shall continue, he being obviously the king that we're talking about, the king of the south, Ptolemy III. Ptolemy III shall continue more years than Seleucus II, the king of the north. There are about 3 guesses, I say, to what this really means. In the first place, there's the guess that Ptolemy will live longer than Seleucus, which is the view of the King James Version, Calvin, Jamieson Fawcett Brown commentary, as well as Leopold's commentary. Well, does our chart bear this out? Ptolemy III, Seleucus II, who lives longer than whom? Well, it looks like by about a period of 3 or 4 years, Ptolemy III does indeed exceed the lifespan of Seleucus II. This is the way that the King James Version, you see, has translated this phrase. And shall continue more years than the king of the north. Shall continue, really ought to tell us live, if that's what the word or what the verse is really saying. And the word really means he shall live longer or live more years than the king of the north. Then another suggestion is that Ptolemy will maintain superiority over Seleucus. So in other words, you have to supply the meaning, not just he shall continue more years, but he shall continue in control more years over the king of the north. It's the view of Jerome in one of the earliest commentaries on Daniel, the view of Keel, their Old Testament commentary said, and the view of Leon Wood. None of these really, however, appear to be satisfactory. I don't think it's necessary to go into a Hebrew study of this as we have to on some occasions with other things, because the words are rather self-explanatory, except maybe for this word continue. What does he really mean there? The word can mean continue. The word is translated like that in some places, but probably the implication here is something different. And that would be a third suggestion, and what we believe to be the correct suggestion, and the idiom that is followed in almost all of the more modern versions. And that is that the king of the south would not come against or attack the king of the north again after the conclusion of the Laodicean War in 245 BC. This appears to be the meaning. So it reads something like this: He shall refrain from the king of the north. Or he shall refrain some years from the king of the north. But we know it's refrained from indefinitely because, in fact, he does not attack again. So the continue more years then is a little bit misleading. The view of the King James Version and some of the older commentators like John Calvin, but really not reliable. As a matter of fact, I think you'll find it true on your chart whenever we come to our next reference, which we're going to get to here in verse 9 in a moment. Then the tables are turned as far as who is attacking whom. And you don't find Ptolemy then on the attack against the king of the north again. So I favor that, and I think most of the new, more modern versions will bear that out. He, the king of the south, shall refrain from, that is, refrain from advance against, or attack against the king of the north. That leaves us with one more verse, verse 9. We've got plenty of time. I don't know whether we should start into verse 10. I don't think we will because it'll be a new section, so maybe we'll be through early tonight. Verse 9, the king, now let's first of all, this is a very confusing verse that we're going to have to rearrange in I don't know how many different ways to get it right. As long as you understand what's being said, well, you can't leave it written the way it is in King James because you just don't understand what's being said. In verse 7, the one who's on the attack is Ptolemy III. He attacks the king of the north. He's successful. The dividends of his success are provided in the first part of verse 8. And then wrapping up, this last phrase really wraps up the Laodicean War. Wrapping up, the angel predicts that Ptolemy III, the king of the south, will not come upon the king of the north again, which in fact is true according to historical records. And so it would seem like, well, since he's not going to come again, the king of the south is not going to come again, then, you know, exactly what's going to happen with regard to the king of the north and the king of the south. So verse 9, so the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his own land. In other words, just the way that you have it written there, it's quite confusing, and it ends up really being nonsense. It would read logically without meaning something like this: that the king of the south, since that's who verse 9 mentions, the king of the south will come into the southern kingdom. The king of the south shall come into his kingdom. So that's obviously true. The king of the south will come into the southern kingdom, and he shall return to his own land, which is the southern kingdom, which is saying the same thing again. So whenever you spot something like that, then you have to start doing some digging. I mean, when you read a verse like that, it kind of stands out a little bit. Now, the last king that's mentioned in verse 8, and I've shown you before how every time we get to one of these climatic verses, it's a transitional verse. It's preparing us to jump right into the next thing, like the end of verse 6 with the beginning of verse 7, the beginning of the Laodicean War passage. It's transitional because you've got to make a change in your train of thought, and it's provided there in the verse for you. The last word, the last topic, or whatever that's mentioned, jumps right over and carries right into the next verse. Well, the last one who's mentioned is the king of the north. But, you know, he's not even mentioned in verse 9. And then whenever we get to verse 10, which is really beyond our confines tonight, but his sons would be the sons of the king of the south, shall be stirred up and shall assemble a great multitude of forces. And one of these of the sons of the king of the south shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up, even his fortress. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler. Well, now, were the sons, in verse 10, the sons of the king of the south or the king of the north? If they were the sons of the king of the south, then why is the king of the south mad in verse 11? But if they were the sons of the king of the north, then verse 11 would be some type of counterattack with regard to the king of the south, that he's moved with choler then against the king of the north. So verse 9 is supposed to serve as a perfect transition from verse 8 to verse 10. The end of verse 8, we have that the king of the south will refrain from attacking the king of the north. So probably, well, it's more than probably, it's definitely true. Again, it's just a poor arrangement. I don't even have it arranged correctly because you almost have to rewrite the whole verse. But the subject of verse 9 is not the king of the south, but obviously it's the king of the north. So you end up without all of these tautologies of the king of the south deciding it's time to go home, so he goes into the southern kingdom, and then after he goes into the southern kingdom, he decides it's time that he should return to his own land. Well, he's already there. How can you return to your own land, the southern kingdom, if before that you decided to return to his land, which is the southern kingdom? However, if we kind of rearrange all this and make the subject of the sentence, instead of the king of the south, the king of the north, then we've got, so the king of the north shall come into his kingdom. Well, not his privately, but the other persona of verse 8, which would be the king of the south. And then after he's done that, then he shall return to his own land, which means the king of the north would go back home. Okay, no. People say, no, do that over again. Well, the subject is the king of the north. The king of the north decides to attack the king of the south, which he does. He's not very successful. He decides to go back home, which he does. Which is what the verse is, in a very awkward way, trying to say. Therefore, in placing the king of the north on the offensive, finally, verses 7 and 8, he's been on the defensive side. Placing him on the offensive, this opens the way up for the connection that we're saying exists here between verse 8 and verse 10, or verse 9 and verse 10, or verses 7 and 8 to verses 10 through 19, a whole nother section in itself. Putting the king of the north on the offensive side of the board opens the way up for this next long section from verses 10 to 19 that's going to be speaking as its topic about the superiority of the king and of the kingdom of the north over the kingdom of the south, which is going to be something different than what we're used to, since verses 7 and 8 have provided the victorious account of the king of the south. The King James Version follows this, Calvin follows this, Barnes follows this. They all follow the mistake of the King James Version. JFB commentary follows this, as well as a few others. However, I think you'll find in most of the modern versions that, again, it's been corrected. Don't bog down in trying to think, well, how in the world could something as confusing as this, end up? When, the meaning of the whole verse is totally reversed from the way that you have it in King James. Well, that's just the way that it is. It just makes no sense if you leave it there by itself. And it provides no connection, which a verse like this, that's a pivotal transitional verse, should do. It provides no connection between the 8th and the 10th verses. We're going to have something that gets us ready to start talking now about the offensive moves and wars of the king of the north. Well, if you haven't already, you can look on your chart, Daniel 11:9, 240 BC, 5 years after the conclusion to the Laodicean War, the king of the north is finally taking the offensive side. And he attacks Egypt. So the king of the north attacks the king of the south. He comes into his kingdom. This last phrase, and shall return unto his own land, implies that his attack really did nothing at all but waste everyone's time. And as far as we know, that's true. There were not any great battles or great events that took place that are worth recording. He just made an attack. His attack was repulsed. Not like it lasted for months or years or even weeks. He just made an attack. His attack is repulsed and he goes back home. So this all takes place in the year 240. That's why we said that verses 7, 8, and 9 are a section in themselves, in that we've got the same kings being discussed, Ptolemy III and Seleucus II. But really there's a division between the 8th and the 9th verse, because there's 5 years of time that elapses between those two. The Laodicean War in verses 7 to 8, and then now a counterattack 5 years later in the year 240 BC. One more thing before we get to one final thing this evening concerns the extent of the Seleucid Empire at this time. You don't have really any reference to this. You have to get it from history. We know from our discussions earlier tonight that whenever Ptolemy III did attack Seleucia, Antioch, the whole realm, he overran the entire Seleucid Empire. He took everything. But what the record here in Daniel 11 really doesn't go into elaborate details about is the fact that when Ptolemy, according to Justin's writing, is called back home to put down some internal strife and revolt and rebellion, whenever he returns back home, obviously, Seleucus II comes out of hiding in the Taurus Mountains, comes back to the throne, and pretty much recaptures, gathers back to himself, to his empire, to his throne, everything that Ptolemy III had taken before. So by the time we get down to, let's say, 241 BC, we're back stalemate, we're back with the balances being fairly equal. The Seleucid Empire is not just some speck on the map, because 5 years later it was overrun by the Ptolemies. It was 5 years earlier overrun by the Ptolemies, but they've gathered everything back now. So it's equal. So that's why the Seleucids under Seleucus II decide to counterattack and see if maybe they can't get back a few of their own gods that were taken down to Egypt. But nothing comes of that. It's just a stalemate. He returns back home, and that's why you just kind of have a no-nonsense, up-in-the-air, gray, middle, in-between phrase here that he'll return to his own land. In other words, if you're thinking, well, I wish he'd tell us what happened in the war, he is telling you by a statement like that. Nothing really happened. He just went down there, attacked, and then he returned home. One final thing before we're through tonight, and that concerns high priesthood. I think we've discussed just about everything. I don't remember what all I've given you before, so I think I'll review that briefly. It can be summed up in just a couple of sentences. To get us down to the time of the high priest in Jerusalem during this period, let's say 240 BC, and especially his the high priest that comes after him, because that's when things get very interesting. I said before I raised the question, in case you haven't, I answered it for you before, why study high priesthood, since later on in intertestamental period class we're going to look at the topic of religion, the religious side of the 400 years. And wasn't the high priesthood a religious institution? Well, at one time it was. But by the time we get to Onias II and Simon II, it's really become a political game of who can offer the biggest bribe, then they can become the high priest. So that's why I decided to take that more or less. We're going to discuss high priest and priesthood, and I know some of you are getting bogged down here so much in Daniel 11. I am too sometimes. There's so much here. Remember what we're studying. We're going to get into the New Testament and discuss scribes and Sanhedrin and the high priest and the captain of the guard and all types of things that arose during the period between the Testaments. Do a study of the Zealots, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. We have all that still before us.
Great.
But that comes over in the religious area. You say, well, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were hardly more religious than the high priesthood. Well, that's true, but definitely you've got to put the period somewhere to politics and get into religion. So I decided to go ahead and include them here because of what's going to start taking place with the house of the Onias and the house of the Tobias. So anyway, Onias the first. Not very many people know very much about the high priesthood. As I said before, Josephus is the only one who really provides us with any information, and not all of his is reliable. As a matter of fact, I'll bring some whenever we get to the appropriate place to show you just how confusing and self-contradictory he really is and can be. Onias the first is the son of Jaddua. We all know about Jaddua earlier. His son is Simon the First, the son of Onias the First. You have on your chart the phrase, the just, in parentheses. We'll discuss that later. But what they mean by that is, was Simon the First also known as Simon the Just, or was Simon the Second known as Simon the Just? It's a very involved technical question that it's difficult to come to a definite answer on, but we'll do our best with that later on. So that's why they've got it in parentheses and the question mark after the whole phrase, Simon the First, the Just, and not just after Simon the First. In other words, the question marks really have to do with dates. We know that this was the line of the high priesthood. We know what order they came. Onias the First, Simon the First, on down the line. That's given to us in Josephus. That's fairly easy to determine. But when did they rule? What were their time periods? That's what the question mark is about. But what I'm saying, if you look over there on the far left, Simon the First, the Just, is that a question also relates to who went by this distinction as the Just. I mean, that's a pretty good title. He was just, whoever it was. Who was good, Simon the Second or Simon the First? Then the next high priest, Eleazar, was another son of Onias the First and a brother of Simon the First. And I think I've given you already the references in Josephus before. His brother is Eleazar. Then his uncle, the uncle of Eleazar, is Manasseh. And then when we get to Onias, we're back to the immediate line of Onias the First, Simon the First. Onias the Second was the son of Simon the First. Okay, do we understand that? So we've got Jaddua to Onias, that's father's son, to Simon, father's son, to Eleazar, brother, to Manasseh, uncle, nephew, to Onias the Second, and for that we skip back to Simon the First, and he was a direct descendant, a son of Simon the First. Now when we get to Onias the Second, as well as Simon the Second, as well as this man named Joseph. If you see Joseph, he's called a tax farmer. Well, we'll discuss a little about Joseph and his tax farming policies whenever we get down to that period. But whenever we get here, this is where all of the carnal intrigues, the monetary propositions begin in the intertestamental Jewish high priesthood, and we'll definitely start spending a little more time with the high priesthood, interspersing that with our studies, or in our studies here in Daniel 11, because it's simply fascinating what goes on as far as the high priesthood is concerned. And of course, all of this, remember, is preparing us to open up our New Testament. That's what the whole class is about, to open up your New Testament. And when it says that Annas was the high priest, or Caiaphas was the high priest, then what does that mean? As a matter of fact, the New Testament calls both of them. If you read, I think it's over in Luke chapter 3, about the second verse, Annas, the high priest, Caiaphas being high priests, plural. They were both high priests. Well, is that a correct translation, or could that be possible, or could study of the period between the Testaments give us an understanding of what Luke meant by something like that? That there were two high priests. They didn't have that in the Old Testament. Aaron was Aaron, the high priest.